It was snowing in Winterfell when Jon Snow was born. The wind was sharp, and the sky was heavy with clouds, like it always was in the north. Ned Stark had just come back from Robert's rebellion, and the war had taken a lot out of him. His face was tired, his eyes had seen too much, and his sword hadn't rested in months. But when he walked into that quiet room, and the midwife placed the baby in his arms, everything else faded away. That moment, that tiny cry, that was all that mattered. Jon wasn't born in Dorne, and he wasn't hidden away. He was born in Winterfell, in a back room of the keep, where only a few trusted people knew the truth. The servants whispered, "Of course, they always do," but nobody had the courage to ask Lord Stark anything. He was a quiet man, not cruel, but he had that cold air around him, and once he said something, it was final. Jon's mother, nobody knew who she was. And that was strange, because if Ned Stark had taken some southern girl during the war, there would have been rumors, stories, even songs. But there was nothing. Some said she died giving birth, others said Ned had loved her, but she was a common girl and couldn't be brought to Winterfell. But the truth, well, the truth was something Ned carried alone, because Ned Stark was Jon's real father. He had made a mistake just once before the war, before Robert's rebellion started. There was a girl in a village near the neck. Her name was Willa, a healer's daughter. She had kind eyes, gentle hands. Ned met her when he was riding south with Benjen before the fighting began. They stayed one night in the village. He didn't plan anything. It just happened. He never saw her again. Not until much later, when he came back from war and learned she died giving birth to his son. That news broke him in a way nobody ever saw. People thought Ned Stark was just quiet, cold. But really, he carried guilt every single day. He blamed himself for the war, for the death of his friends, for what happened to Lyanna. And now for Willa too. He could have left the child there. He could have sent gold or kept him hidden in some village. But he didn't. He brought him home. That was the thing about Ned Stark. He took responsibility, even when it crushed him. Catelyn wasn't happy, not one bit. When she first saw the baby, she didn't even speak. She turned and walked out of the room, and for days she barely looked at Ned. He tried to explain, but what could he say? That he'd been weak once? That he'd broken his vows? She didn't want to hear it. She didn't hate Jon, not at first. She just ignored him, treated him like air. But over time that coldness turned to bitterness, and the boy felt it every day. The other kids, Robb, Sansa, Arya, even Bran, they didn't know the full story. They just knew Jon wasn't like them. He didn't have a mother. He didn't have a name. Snow, they called him. That was the name given to bastards in the north. But Ned never called him that with anger. He called him Jon. Simple, soft, with a father's love hidden behind his eyes. He trained him with the sword. He taught him about honor, duty, the old gods. He treated him like a son, because that's exactly what he was. Still, Jon could feel it, the looks, the whispers. He wasn't blind. He knew Catelyn didn't love him. He saw the way servants paused when he entered a room. He wasn't truly part of the family, no matter how much he wanted to be, and that's what hurt the most. Not being a Snow, not being a bastard, but not being fully accepted, always half in, half out. Like Winterfell was home, but not quite. Years passed. Jon grew taller, sharper. His swordsmanship was better than Robb's. He had a quiet strength in him. But that same silence made people uneasy. They said he was too brooding, too serious. Just like Ned, Arya adored him, though. She clung to him like a shadow. They had the same eyes, same temper. She said he was the only one who understood her, and maybe that was true, because Jon knew what it felt like to be different, to not fit into the mold. Then came the day Maester Luwin handed Ned a letter. It had the king's seal. Robert Baratheon was coming to Winterfell. Everything changed that day. Ned stood in the godswood for hours, staring at the old trees. He knew Robert would ask him to be Hand of the King. He didn't want to go. He didn't want to leave his children. But honor, that word haunted him, and he couldn't say no to his oldest friend. That night, he found John sitting alone near the stables, feeding the direwolves. Ghost was already full-grown, with his red eyes glowing in the dark. "John," Ned said, sitting beside him, "we need to talk." John looked at him, serious as always. "Is it about the king coming?" "In part," Ned replied. He hesitated, then sighed. "You're growing older. Soon you'll want to make your own way in the world." John didn't answer, just looked down at Ghost. The wolf tilted its head but stayed quiet. "I know it's been hard," Ned said. "Living here, being different." "I'm a Snow," John said softly. "I'm not like Rob." "You're my son," Ned said, firm. "No matter what name you carry." John looked up, surprised. Ned had never said it like that before. Not so directly. "Do you wish I'd never brought you here?" Ned asked. John shook his head. "Winterfell is the only home I've known." Ned nodded slowly. "Then you'll always have a place here, even when I'm gone." John didn't understand what he meant, but that moment stayed with him forever, and just like that the wheel began to turn. Robert was on his way. The crown was coming north. Secrets buried in snow were about to stir, and Jon Snow, Ned's real son, was standing at the edge of a future he couldn't yet see. When the royal party finally arrived, it was like watching fire march into snow. Everything about King Robert was loud. His laugh, his voice, the way he clapped Ned on the back like they were still young and wild. He was fatter than Jon expected, with a beard full of crumbs and eyes that had seen better days. But he had presence. You could feel it when he rode in, with his gold crown shining even in the north's grey sky. Beside him rode Queen Cersei. And even Jon, who didn't know much about the world, could tell there was something sharp behind her smile. Her hair was golden, her gown was bright, but her eyes, they didn't shine, not like the rest of her. They were cold, like ice that pretends to melt. Prince Joffrey was with them too. He sat his horse like he owned it, chin up, sneering already. Sansa looked at him like he was made of stars. Jon just watched quietly, standing off to the side like always, next to Robb and Theon. He wasn't introduced to the royal family. He didn't expect to be. After all the greetings and the feast, Jon found himself back at the stables again. That was the place he felt most normal, away from the long tables, the music, and the polished looks. Ghost lay beside him, ears twitching, ever watchful. Then someone walked in. It was Tyrion Lannister. Jon had heard of him. The Imp, they called him. The Queen's brother, but nothing like her. Shorter than most boys, with mismatched eyes and a walk that looked painful, but he had a sharp tongue and a quicker mind. "You must be the bastard," Tyrion said, sipping wine and looking Jon over like a book he was trying to understand. Jon straightened a bit, unsure if it was an insult. Tyrion smiled. "Relax, I'm one too. Only difference is I wear my shame like armor." Jon didn't know what to say, so he stayed quiet. "I saw you out there. You're not like the rest. You watch, you don't talk much." "Talking doesn't change anything," Jon said. Tyrion chuckled. "Spoken like a man, twice your age. You'd make a good Lannister." Jon didn't laugh. Tyrion didn't mind. "You ever think of leaving this place?" Tyrion asked, a bit more serious. Jon nodded slowly. "Sometimes. There's not much for me here." Tyrion tilted his head. "Then maybe it's time to find a place that is." That night, Jon thought long and hard. The idea of joining the Night's Watch had always been somewhere in his mind. His uncle Benjen was there. It was a life of duty and purpose, a place where names didn't matter, only your sword and your oath. But now it felt more like an escape. A few days later, when Ned agreed to go south with Robert, everything happened fast. Sansa was to be betrothed to Joffrey, and Arya was begging. Not to go. Robb would stay behind to watch over Winterfell, and Jon, well, he made his choice. He told Ned the morning they were to leave. "I want to take the Black," Jon said, standing outside the stable while snow fell softly around them. Ned looked at him, long and quiet. "Are you sure?" "There's nothing else for me here," Jon said. "Not really." Ned nodded slowly. "Then I'll speak to Benjen. You'll ride with him." Jon felt something in his chest, half relief, half sadness. He didn't know if he was running or becoming something, but it was happening. Before they parted, Ned pulled him aside. "There's something I should tell you," he said. Jon looked up, but just then Robb called out, and servants began shouting, and the horses stamped and neighed. The moment was lost. Ned hesitated, then just rested a hand on Jon's shoulder. "When we meet again," he said, "we'll talk." "I promise," Jon nodded. He didn't know that would be the last time they'd ever speak. As Ned rode south and Jon turned toward the wall, both of them carried the same thing, truths they couldn't say, and a world waiting to change. At Castle Black, the cold was worse than Jon imagined. The wall loomed above everything like a giant of ice. The men there weren't noble warriors, like the stories said. They were thieves, murderers, runaways. But they fought. They lived. They had rules. In their own way, they were brothers. Jon trained hard. He was better with a sword than most of them, but it wasn't the fighting that shaped him. It was the silence, the cold nights, the questions. He kept thinking of Ned's face when he said, "We'll talk." He wondered what his father had wanted to say. Weeks passed. Then one day, word came to the wall. Lord Eddard Stark had been arrested in King's Landing. Accused of treason. Jon couldn't believe it. Ned betraying the crown, it made no sense. The next letter broke everything. Lord Stark was dead, executed, beheaded. Jon sat in the cold, staring at the flames in the fireplace, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a Stark. He felt lost. The wall was supposed to be his new beginning, but now it felt like a prison. He wanted answers. He wanted justice. But most of all, he just wanted his father back. And now, the boy called Snow, the boy who had never truly belonged, he began to change. Because when everything else is taken from you, all you have left is who you choose to become. Jon didn't sleep the night he heard Ned was dead. He just sat there in the cold, staring into nothing. His brothers in black came and went, offered a word or two, but he barely heard them. The fire didn't warm him, and even Ghost curled up beside him like he knew something was broken. That night changed Jon. He'd always carried a shadow inside him, but now it grew. The one man he'd looked up to, the one who'd brought him in when he could have been left in the snow, was gone. And not just gone, killed, dishonored, called a traitor. The world didn't feel right after that. Jon started drifting through his days at Castle Black. He did his duties, trained harder than ever, but something in him had gone cold. His brothers noticed. Sam tried to cheer him up, but Jon just gave short answers. He didn't want comfort, he wanted truth, and he kept hearing that last thing Ned said, "We'll talk, I promise." What had he wanted to say? What secret had he taken to his grave? Then one evening, Maester Aemon called for Jon. "You lost your father," the old man said, his eyes cloudy but his voice clear. "But you have not lost yourself, unless you let grief steal that too." Jon stayed quiet. "I know what it is. To love someone deeply," Aemon said, "and to lose them in a world that does not care." Jon looked up, surprised. "You were a Targaryen, weren't you?" The old man smiled softly. "Long ago. But blood means little on the wall. Here, we're brothers, not lords, not bastards." That stuck with Jon. He'd been holding on to the idea of being a Stark his whole life. But now, what did that even mean? A few weeks later, a rider arrived from Winterfell. The ravens hadn't said much, just that Robb was gathering the north. War was coming. And suddenly, Jon felt it again. That pull. That voice inside him saying, "You're not supposed to be here, not yet." He thought about leaving, just for a moment, going south to fight for his family. But he knew what that meant, breaking his oath, giving up everything. One night, he packed his things. Ghost padded quietly beside him, like he already knew what was happening, but before Jon could pass the gates, Sam stopped him. "If you leave, you'll be like the rest," Sam said, out of breath. "A deserter. They'll hunt you, kill you." "My father is dead," Jon said. "My brothers are going to war. I can't stay here and do nothing." Sam looked at him, eyes wide. "But he'd want you to stay." "How would you know what he'd want?" Jon snapped. "Because he raised you right," Sam said. "And if he really was your father, he'd want you to honor your vow." Jon froze. That word hit him deep. If. He turned and walked into the dark, but something in his chest twisted. At sunrise, Jon returned. He didn't say a word. He just stood there as the others gathered, surprised but quiet. He'd made his choice. If the wall was going to be his life, then he'd live it fully. No more half measures. Soon after, Lord Commander Mormont called for volunteers for a mission beyond the wall. There were rumors of wildlings moving in strange ways, people disappearing, darkness in the woods. Jon stepped forward. "I'll go," he said. Mormont nodded. "Good. You'll see what the world really is out there." And with that, Jon left the safety of Castle Black and entered the wild north, the land of snow, shadows, and things the South had long forgotten. The cold was worse beyond the wall. It cut deeper, stayed longer. But Jon didn't mind. It reminded him of home. They rode with torches, swords drawn. Every sound felt like it could be something dangerous. Jon kept Ghost close, always watching the trees. They found burned villages, empty camps. No bodies, just ashes and silence. Something was wrong out there. One night, while the others were sleeping, Jon sat beside the fire, staring into it like it might speak. And that's when Corin Halfhand approached. "You've got Stark in your face," he said. Jon didn't respond. "But you've also got questions behind your eyes." Jon looked at him. "What if I was never meant to be here?" "You're here now," Corin said. "And maybe the wall's the only place a man can be something more than his name." Jon didn't sleep much after that, because deep down, he knew he wasn't just Ned Stark's son anymore. He was becoming something else, and the wall, with all its cold and silence, was changing him, turning him into a man, or maybe something more. Out beyond the wall, the air didn't just feel cold. It felt old, like the wind had been whispering the same warnings for 1,000 years, and no one had ever listened. Jon could feel it in his bones. Something wasn't right. They kept riding north, deeper into the frozen wilderness. Each day, they found more signs. Burned huts, half-eaten horses, strange symbols drawn in the snow. No wildlings, no bodies, just emptiness. The brothers whispered at night. Some said the White Walkers were back, others laughed it off. But when men started going missing, no one laughed anymore. Jon stuck close to Corin Halfhand. The ranger moved like a shadow, quiet, sharp, always watching the trees like they were hiding eyes. He taught Jon things the wall didn't. How to listen for silence, how to read tracks in the snow, how to kill a man before he speaks. "You want to live out here," Corin said. "You learn to forget who you were. Even your name can get you killed." Jon didn't say it, but he'd already started forgetting. Not the memories, those still came in dreams. But the name Snow didn't sting the way it used to. Neither did Stark. They felt like pieces of a story he'd read long ago, one that didn't belong to him anymore. Then came the wildlings. They didn't ambush them. They didn't attack. They waited, watched, tracked them like wolves. One night, Corin sent Jon ahead with a small group to scout. When they came back, they found the others dead. Corin stood over the bodies in the snow. Blood had soaked through the ice. Eyes wide, mouths open. No fight, no screams. Just death. "We're being hunted," he said. That night they moved quick, but it was too late. They were surrounded by morning. Wildlings stepped out of the trees, dozens of them, dirty, hard-faced, covered in furs and scars, and in front of them stood a tall, sharp-eyed man with red hair and a voice like thunder, Tormund Giant's Bane. "You Night's Watch boys don't belong this far north," he said, grinning. "You're either brave or stupid." "Maybe both," Corin replied, drawing his sword. Jon stood beside him, heart pounding, fingers tight on the hilt of Longclaw. He knew they wouldn't win this, not outnumbered like this. But he also knew Corin wouldn't go down easy. Tormund raised a hand. "We don't have to kill you." Corin glanced at Jon, just a flick of his eyes, a silent message. Then he turned to Tormund and said, "You can take the boy." Jon looked at him, stunned. "What?" Corin didn't blink. "They won't trust you unless you become one of them. Do it. Earn it." Before Jon could protest, Corin lunged at him, blade flashing. It happened fast. Steel rang out, snow flew, ghosts snarled in the background, and then it was over. Corin lay bleeding in the snow, and Jon stood over him, sword in hand, chest heaving. He'd done it. He'd killed a brother. The wildling stood still for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You've got ice in your blood," Tormund said. "Maybe you'll live." They took Jon with them, deeper into the wild. Ghost followed, never leaving his side. At first, Jon kept quiet. Watched. Listened. The free folk weren't like he'd been told. They weren't savages. They had their own laws, their own strength. They weren't fighting for power. They were fighting to survive, and then he met her. Ygritte. She was fire in the snow. Wild, fierce, with a laugh that echoed through the mountains. She didn't trust him, mocked him, challenged him every time he opened his mouth. But over time, something shifted. The way she looked at him, the way he listened to her stories of freedom, of crossing the wall, not for war, but for life. She made him question everything. Was the Night's Watch really noble? Was the wall protecting people or dividing them? What if the wildlings weren't enemies at all? And every night, Jon thought about Ned, thought about the man who'd raised him to follow rules, to serve honor, to keep his word. But what if honor wasn't enough? One night, as he and Ygritte sat near a fire in a mountain cave, she looked at him and said, "You know nothing, Jon Snow." He wanted to argue, but he didn't, because she was right. He didn't know where he belonged anymore. He didn't know if being Ned Stark's son still meant anything. All he knew was the war wasn't black and white. It was grey, cold, messy. And Jon Snow, bastard, brother, traitor, killer, was stuck in the middle of it. Jon didn't sleep much in the days that followed. Even though he was with the free folk now, eating their food, walking in their paths, he still felt like a shadow in their world. Ygritte stayed close, but even she didn't fully trust him. Not yet. They marched toward the wall. Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall, had gathered all the wildling clans. Thousands of them, old men, warriors, women carrying children, giants riding woolly beasts. They weren't just coming to fight. They were running from something worse than the Night's Watch. The White Walkers were real. Jon had seen what they left behind. Villages frozen solid, men with blue eyes and no soul. Dead things, walking like they remembered who they used to be. The wall wasn't just a border anymore. It was the last line between life and death. But Mance wasn't interested in war. Not really. He just wanted to get his people south before winter swallowed them whole. The Night's Watch wouldn't allow it. So war was coming whether anyone wanted it or not. One morning, Jon stood at the top of a ridge with Tormund and Ygritte, staring at the wall in the distance. "Looks smaller than I remember," Jon said quietly. Ygritte smirked. "That's because you've grown." Tormund grunted. "You sure you're not thinking of running back to your brothers?" Jon didn't answer, but in his heart, he knew he couldn't stay with them. No matter what he felt, he wasn't free folk, He never would be. He was still his father's son. He was still a man of the Night's Watch. That night, when the camp was sleeping and the fires were low, Jon slipped away. He didn't look back. Ghost followed him through the dark, and together they made their way across the snow, dodging patrols, climbing rocks, sneaking past wild wolves and colder things. He was half dead when he reached the wall, covered in blood and frost. His sword heavy in his hand. Castle Black was a mess. The brothers were scared, divided, and barely holding the wall. When Jon stumbled in, they almost killed him on sight. "I need to speak to the Lord Commander," he said through cracked lips. "Maester." Eamon came instead, and Sam, they cleaned him up, gave him broth, listened to his story. "They're coming," Jon said. "All of them, not just raiders, every wildling that still draws breath. And if we don't hold the wall—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. They knew. Soon after, the battle came. Fire and arrows lit the night. Giants roared. Wildlings screamed. The brothers of the Night's Watch fought with everything they had. Jon led from the front. He fought like a man with nothing left to lose. Ygritte found him in the chaos. She raised her bow. He raised his sword. They stood there, staring, and then an arrow from someone else struck her. She fell into his arms. "I told you," she whispered. "You know nothing." Jon Snow. He held her until she was gone. That night broke something inside him. He'd thought he could serve honor, love someone, and still do what was right. But in the end, the wall didn't care. War didn't care. Winter didn't care. When the fighting was over and the wildlings retreated, Jon went back to his cell. He stared at the walls for hours, not thinking, not feeling, just breathing. Then word came. Stannis Baratheon had landed north of the wall, with soldiers, banners, power. Jon met him in the courtyard. "You're Ned Stark's son," Stannis said, eyes sharp. "I knew your father. He was an honest fool." Jon said nothing. "I could make you a Stark," Stannis said. "Lord of Winterfell, no longer a Snow, no longer a bastard." Jon looked at him for a long time, and then he shook his head. "My father raised me to serve, not to rule," he said, and he walked away. Later, when the brothers of the Night's Watch gathered to elect a new Lord Commander, Jon didn't speak. He didn't campaign, but they chose him anyway, not because he was noble, not because he was Ned Stark's son, but because he was the only one who had stood when the world was falling. He took the black again, stood at the top of the wall, wind in his face, looking out at the snow and ice. And for the first time, he understood what his father had carried all those years, not just honor, but burden, the weight of choices that never felt clean. Jon wasn't a boy anymore. He wasn't a bastard with a chip on his shoulder. He was a man, a Stark, even if no one called him that. And in the end, that was enough.